All right, so today I'm going to be talking about single-page apps, obviously, and it's kind of what I've been focused on here in my work at Skookum for the past 6 months. So I felt like since in my prior experience I've never done anything like single-page app development or like JavaScript application code, I thought it would be valuable for me to tell you some of the basics because I just picked them up over the past several months myself. So we're going to talk about some pretty basic things and we'll get into some more advanced concepts too. So hopefully there will be something for everybody. So like I was saying, I've been a web developer for about 6 years now. Before Skookum, the websites I built were really more like marketing sites, and they didn't have a lot of complicated JavaScript. Like I had to work with jQuery and stuff like that, but I wasn't really doing anything complicated. I wasn't concerned with like browser memory management or like sophisticated event handling or any of that kind of thing. So this has been a whole new world for me and really a crash course in JavaScript. So to start out, like, what's a single-page app? Basically, you have all of your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript loaded onto one page. Typically, it's going to, compile out into one file, your HTML, and then it's going to just reference all of your scripts and everything. And instead of going back to the server every time to retrieve the new pages or the new data, the elements like shift out dynamically. So you don't have to actually refresh the page, which is what makes it really cool and really responsive. I should say right now as well, this talk is only concerning front end. For back end, pretty much build a REST API, whatever tools you like, whether Node or Ruby on Rails or .NET or whatever. But this is about front end. So I really learned the hard way that knowing jQuery and knowing how to like show and hide things is a lot different than writing application.js. The first single-page app I tried to build, I wasn't using like a building or a packaging system or a static site generator or anything like that. I hand-coded this massive like HTML file, and I had all my Knockout templates like hard-coded in there. And I didn't know how to do routing or anything, so none of my states had URLs. So the back button didn't work, and you couldn't share links with anybody, and it was just kind of a mess, but that's how you learn. So I also learned that they're more challenging to debug in certain ways. So we'll get into that more later, but there's really interesting things that can happen with like your event handling and things you need to look for in Internet Explorer and stuff like that. So why would you consider building a single-page app? Well, here at Skookum, we're a big fan of client-server architecture, so keeping the client and the server very separate. So like I was saying before, with your backend code, if you're just making a REST API, that allows you to put any sort of front end on it. So you could make an iPhone app, you could make a single-page web app, you could make a single-page mobile app. You can kind of mix and match however you need to, and the data is always there in a consistent, reliable format. And it just really helps you separate your concerns and not get like application code mixed in with your templates and stuff like that. So having those loosely coupled is really nice in my experience. It's also somewhat lower overhead for the server because it's not having to serve up a new page and like reload those files every time you make a request or go to a different page. So that's cool too. Another thing that's nice about single-page apps is user experience. Typically, they'll feel more native and more responsive to the user and just faster. It's also pretty well suited for mobile for that reason as well. And also because on mobile you want to minimize the requests that you're making. So just having everything loaded up front is really helpful for performance. And I think a common misconception with these types of apps is that they're not accessible. And you actually can make them accessible with WAI ARIA roles. The ones especially for like dialogues are super helpful for people who use screen readers and that type of thing. So you can definitely make single-page apps accessible now. That wasn't the case in the past, but it's much easier to do that nowadays. One caveat I will say, if you need your app to rank well in SEO in the search engines, I wouldn't necessarily go for this technique. There is a way to get Google to index it, but it's kind of funky. And you can look that up if you're interested. And then also there's the developer experience. I just think it's really fun to build apps in this way because you can run everything on your local environment. It's very fast. You don't have to like check out the backend code and run it because you can just like ping the server and get the data. So I think it's a fun way to develop, and I'll show you some of my workflow in a couple minutes. So the structure of a single-page app. The framework I use has the principle called MVVM, which stands for Model, View, View Model. So the model is, of course, your data on the server that's in the database. The view is your HTML templates, and then the view model is kind of the JavaScript that glues those two things together. You also have your controller, which defines like sort of the different states of your app. And I like to use a publish-subscribe pattern. Basically, there are variables in the app that like publish different events, and you can subscribe to them, and it allows you to control things in real time. So we'll get more into that in a few minutes. So now I'd like to talk about some of the tools I like to use. I like to use a static site generator. Right now I'm using Wintersmith. A lot of these tools you'll see they're based on Node. For many of these, there's an equivalent in Ruby or whatever framework you want to use. So I like to use Wintersmith. It gives me a local server so that I can just load up my app and locally. And also it compiles all of my files for me. It watches all of my templates and all my JavaScript and CSS and automatically rebuilds them when anything changes. So it just kind of handles that and allows you to develop really rapidly. I use Jade and Stylus for my HTML and CSS templating. We can take a look at that real quick. This is a sample Jade file. It's an HTML preprocessor templating language. So you can see, I just really like the syntax of this. It's a lot easier to use than HTML. You don't have to like remember to close elements. It's very elegant looking. It's also easier to work with Knockout templates with, which we'll get into in a few minutes. And then Stylus, like most CSS preprocessors, you're able to declare variables, so I don't have to keep, redefining these colors and having that multiple times, it makes it more readable, and it's just nicer looking, I think, than CSS. So it's really easy to use this with Wintersmith because it just automatically compiles, and you don't really have to touch actual HTML or CSS. So I like to use Ender for my general JavaScript, like making AJAX requests, DOM manipulation, the same sorts of things that a lot of people like to use jQuery for. I prefer Ender because you get to pick and choose which modules you want. You don't have to include this big monolithic thing with all these functions you might not necessarily use. So jQuery has a lot of overhead. I like Ender a lot, just because it's you get to mix and match and just get exactly what you're going to use in your application. Common.js, I use that for module loading so that you can have your JavaScript broken up into well-defined modules. We'll show you some of that later. And I like Radio.js as well for broadcasting events. So it's really good for inter-module communication within your app because you can broadcast something in one module and then pick it up in the other one. So it's really cool if you need to, send an object or something between modules. It's pretty cool. So I'm going to show you my demo app. So I thought it would be kind of festive to do a beer encyclopedia since it's St. Patrick's Day is coming up on Sunday. And also, there's an open beer database API. I've learned it's actually not very good. You can't find very many beers that are common in it. But if I search for something really generic like ale, you can see the results come up. You can view a specific beer. And it's all just kind of fast and seamless. Like you notice the page never reloads. So it's just a very simple app. And the code that I'm going back and forth and referring to is all from this app. And it's on GitHub. And I'll give you guys the URL at the end. So I've kind of already discussed that. All right, so getting started with Knockout. So the first thing you're going to do in Knockout, in your JavaScript, you're going to define a view model. And basically, it's basically just an object. I mean, you can do it as a function if you want to. And it just has, these are called observables. These variables, you can have just regular ones or observable arrays, and you can really store anything you want to in them. Like even with a basic observable, you can pass an object into it. So it's pretty flexible. The biggest misconception I had when I started out with Knockout was I wanted to make literally everything an observable, and that's just not necessary. Really only want to make the things that you need to keep track of and know that they change in real time. Only make those things an observable. You don't need everything. Like for instance, with my app, I could have made like all of the properties of the beer an observable, like the title and the description and the ABV. But we don't have like write access to the database, so those values are not really going to change. So they don't need to be an observable. So for things that aren't really going to change, don't make them observables. The only thing I need to know about for beer is what the current beer is and when that changes. So what I'm storing in here will basically be that object from the server that just has all that data. But the properties themselves do not have to be observables. So just be mindful of that. adding observables also will, like, the more you have, the more overhead your app will have, because for Knockout to work the way it does, there are tons of subscribers out there, you know, kind of listening to see when anything changes. It's just kind of a waste of memory if you have stuff out there that's an observable that's never going to change. So after you declare your view model, you need to call apply bindings on it in order for it to take effect. And so this is a sample template where you can see I'm using these Knockout observables to kind of fill in the template. So let's see where to start here. So you can see these data bind tags. This is how you pull the observables in. And you can use them to set pretty much any type of attribute or text or anything like that. One part of the Knockout templating, they're typically tied to elements, but they don't have to be. You can do them as HTML comments. So that's what I'm doing here. This is what an HTML comment looks like in Jade. It's just a lot prettier and easier to follow than HTML. So basically, you set up your view model, you call apply bindings, and then all this stuff magically pops into your template. It's pretty cool.
Do you normally start with the HTML and like sort of build your page and how it should look, and then write a view model that binds all the dynamic stuff into that page, or do you start writing a view model and then build a page that like lines up to your view model data? Does that make sense?
In this case, I kind of sketched out the pages first, but I really wrote a lot of the JavaScript before I wrote the markup. For an actual project here at Skookum, I probably would write more of the markup out for the pages, just because the designs tend to be more complicated and we need to cross-browser test them first.
So with Knockout, you can like do your normal flow, right? Like HTML, CSS, make it look right, and then make it like alive or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you should use the static site generator even in those beginning stages when you're just writing your CSS and your markup, just to get it into that format and then take advantage of the automatic rebuilding and stuff like that. Good question. Another thing I wanted to point out, you can use, you don't have to use HTML templates with Knockout. You can use like jQuery templates or underscore templates if you prefer that. And you can also use any JavaScript expression that you want to in these data bindings. It doesn't have to just be observable. So this is really powerful. Like here, I'm concatenating, beer name by brewery name. So that's my heading. And so yeah, just don't feel like you're limited by what's an observable and what's not when you're doing your templates. So now I'm going to go into some best practices and tips and gotchas that I encountered as I was learning this way of development. So here is a common thing that you'll probably see the first time you try to build your app. When you load the page or when you reload the page, you might see little snippets of other pages or other views in the page. What causes this is that when the page first loads, your data bindings are not yet initialized. So the browser is just rendering all of your HTML. It doesn't really know what to show yet. So the way to get around that is I just like to set the page or whatever your container element is to display none, so it's hidden by default. And then we use the data binding to toggle a class on that container so that once your data bindings are initialized, only the correct page will show, or the correct div or element or whatever you're trying to show. So the flicker thing can be really jarring, and sometimes you'll see it when you're navigating between views. So this is a really simple trick. It's super annoying if you haven't figured it out yet. So there's that. My second piece of advice is definitely to use modules. Break your JavaScript into modules. Basically, in each module, you want to define only one thing, export only one thing. It'll make your code more maintainable and more testable. I kind of have some pseudocode up here for what like a sample like page module would look like. So of course, first you name it, set initial properties. You're going to call some functions to kick things off. Typically, I'm always fetching data from servers and binding events. You also want to include unbind and destroy functions so you properly clean up after yourself, because that's super important in single-page apps. And then you have a provide statement so that you tell the rest of your app your module can be used and what the name is. So I'm going to show a couple of modules that are used in my demo app. So here's like a super simple module. So probably the most simple module you could possibly have. It's just a JavaScript object. And this is my config file, where I'm just setting my server URL and my public token, which allows me to make requests to the beer database. So you definitely don't want to hard code stuff like this in your files. So probably every single page app or every app you have is going to have something like this. So this is like pretty much the most basic module you can have. That's a common JS thing, yeah. Yeah. I mainly use common JS because it comes with Ender. I know a lot of people like AMD, but I haven't really played with that yet. So you can see, actually, no, it's in my API.
Can you maybe hit Command plus a couple of times or back?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Is that better?
Yeah, that's
So you can see this is my API file where I'm defining my AJAX calls to the API, basically. So you can see all I have to do to include that module is just do require, and then the name that I defined on the module. So it's super simple. With common JS, you do have to be conscientious of the order that you're loading your files in. Like if I had API loaded before config, I wouldn't be able to include config in my file. So that's one of the annoying things about common JS, which I think in AMD it doesn't matter what order you load things in. So this just is something to be aware of. So here's another module that I've done. This is all the stuff for the beer details page. So it's still pretty simple, but it's definitely more complicated than that config module I just had up. So in init, you can see I have my route registered with beer, and then the ID. This notation, this is path.js, by the way, means that it's a required parameter. So the route won't work if it doesn't have an ID, like if you just go to beer. So here I'm loading my beer module. I'm passing in the parameters, which come in through path.js. Then I'm also passing in my current view model because I want my beer details page to be able to read certain values off of current and like set additional observables. So those will then be available to my templates. Then on exit, of course, I'm calling destroy because it's important to clean up after yourself. So this is that module. You can see in this, I'm just setting like the current page. So it has a name and then it has like a URL slug in case I need that anywhere in my template. And I'm also storing the params and the current ID. So on my prototype, I have a simple init function that's called. It basically just says if I have a beer ID, I should go fetch it. And then on fetch, I just have my API call. And then for destroy, I'm just clearing out what the current beer is and what the current page is so that my view will stay updated. So this is a pretty simple module, but it's still doing what it needs to do. And we'll get into some more specifics about what's happening here when I get to those points. So basically, use modules. They're awesome. And everybody will like you who has to touch your code in the future. I touched on this a little bit. Definitely use some type of router so that, well, for a few points, you really want to allow people to be able to bookmark certain pages on your site and use the back button. And if you're not using routes, nobody can go backwards and forwards. And that's kind of horrible. The back button is one of the most used buttons in the web browser. So definitely use some sort of routing library. I like path.js because it's library agnostic. A lot of the jQuery people like SAMI, which is really, it does more than routing. It's kind of an application framework, so it's kind of heavy for my liking. What I don't have up here, with path, it also has an enter function, so you can set something to happen every time you enter a route too. So that's kind of cool. So you always map the two to like the main stuff that you want to happen, and then on exit you always want to clean up after yourself.
Does Path.js, does that support push state?
It does support push state. If you guys don't know what push state is, it's in the HTML. It's new with HTML5 stuff, and it'll allow you to have URLs without this hash mark at the beginning. One thing to be aware of, if you need to support below IE10, I believe. Is that correct, guys? Below IE10 will not support HTML5 push state. So you can either fall back to this, or I just tend to just use this for now so I don't have to manage fallbacks. So now we're going to talk about event listeners. This is super important for single-page apps. So this function that we're looking at here, this is a little thing I wrote to get around a bug in Chrome with the new VW unit, and that doesn't stand for Volkswagen. It stands for viewport width. So basically, you can have responsive text that scales up or down based on the viewport size. I'll show you what it looks like in a sec. But we're talking about events right now. So a few things are happening here. So I have a resize event, and whenever the window is resized, I want to call my repaint function, which it basically triggers the index on the element, so Chrome will redraw it and redraw it correctly. So why didn't I just say window.on resize repaint and call it a day? Well, a few reasons. Because this is a single page app, and across our modules, we don't really know if there are other resize events out there. I'm namespacing this to resize.repaint. So when I want to remove this listener, I know specifically what listener I'm removing. Because if I just say window.offResize, that's going to remove all of my other resize events that could be hanging out there. And we definitely don't want that. So be very specific by namespacing your events. So you can see that I'm calling off on this before I define it to make sure there's not multiples defined. That's pretty important. Like whenever you have an on event, you also want to have an off event. You don't want to just leave stuff hanging out there. And then another special thing I'm doing is I'm wrapping this in underscore the function I'm calling in underscores debounce function. So the way a resize works in Chrome, like as you're resizing, it actually fires a lot of events. And your application probably doesn't care about all those intermediary values that are the browser size. It just really cares about where you end up. So what I'm doing here is called debouncing, and I'm debouncing my resize event. So there's a delay before this is called. So that's 100 milliseconds right there. And this just prevents my function from being run unnecessarily. So this is really pixelated, I'm sorry. But these are just log statements. So when I had the debouncing off, and I just resized the window it was like a really small resize, it ran my function 30 times. And with it debounced, it ran it twice. So it's just definitely a lot smarter memory management to debounce your resize functions. Scroll listeners are really bad like that as well, because every time the user scrolls, it's spitting out like X and Y coordinates. So you can use a similar technique for that. And here's an example of a click handler that didn't get destroyed properly. So basically, I had a click handler that was triggering an AJAX request, and this really cool thing happened where every time I clicked on a subsequent the trigger element, it would increment the number of AJAX requests it made by 1. So you definitely don't want your app doing that. And if you destroy your events properly, you won't have funky things like this happening. And again, the destroy method is a good way of handling that. So these are Knockout specific examples, but here's some cool stuff you can do if you want to know if an observable changes. You can actually subscribe to it and then do something when it changes. So here I'm subscribing to my page observable. Every time I go to a new page, like regardless of what page it is, I want to clear out my error messages. So I don't have old error messages hanging around on subsequent pages. So this is just a really easy way to do that. Their custom subscribe function. And then you can also do computed observables, which are really cool. Here, so you can use it pretty much you can concat two observables together, and it'll auto-update whenever the observables in here get updated. So it's pretty powerful. Here I'm actually using a delay of 500 milliseconds. I was noticing on my search result pagination in my app that that like my error state was popping up as I was paging. So so I made this compute observable that returns with a delay. So and I wrapped my error handling stuff in if blocks looking for this, so that it wouldn't show immediately. So you wouldn't have that like kind of jarring, flickering effect like we saw in the little video earlier. So that's kind of cool. And then also for stuff that's not observable, using an event emitter, like I use radio in this example, is really cool. So this is just to like show and display, to show and hide a progress indicator. So typically in my API call, when I make my AJAX request, I'll like broadcast that the data is loading, and whenever the stuff comes back and I've done what I'm going to do with it, I'll broadcast that it's complete. So you can have that all with just one subscriber, and then just show or hide it conditionally. And that's how I did like the little loading state that you can see in the demo app. And just from a UX perspective, it's really great to have a progress indicator in apps like this, because you don't always know how long the requests are going to take, especially on mobile. It's very dependent on the network and things you can't control. So having that type of feedback to show that something's working is kind of important. Yes. So that's the progress indicator namespace. Oh. That's just, I don't know if I would call that namespacing. That's the data that I'm broadcasting. So it really could be anything. Like, it could be an object, it could be a variable. This is pretty much just a string. So, I can show actually what those broadcast statements.
I don't know what y'all would call them now, but we used to call them messages. That was a generic term for those things.
So you can see, like here on my get beer call, I'm broadcasting the loading complete. So that's what that looks like. That's what that listener is listening to. So. And just like with any other type of event, you can remove these when you don't need them, and that's important to do as well. So I'm going to close out with an Internet Explorer debugging tip. So you'll probably have to debug your app in Internet Explorer. If you don't have to, I'm pretty envious. So you might find when you're trying to debug your single page app that you can't inspect things. And when the debug tools cooperate with you, you can use this little refresh button here. It'll refresh the DOM tree, and then you can inspect stuff just like you normally would on a page. I don't know, maybe everybody knows this, but I just figured this out this week thanks to Patrick, Windows.net guy, so I guess he knows more about this than I do. But yeah, that's really come in handy because I was having to like reload the whole page every time and like close the developer tools and reload and reopen it, and it turns out you can just use this button right here to refresh the DOM tree. So here's the resources. This is my Git repo. It has all the example code in it. And my reference links are in a gist right here, just some kind of supplemental information that you can grab. And that's my presentation. Do y'all have any questions? Any code examples you wanted to look at?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
How do you decide whether you're going to use a like a radio message
Mm-hmm.
versus an observable property?
So
versus subscribing to a change or something like that. Because you could theoretically, right, like have
you
an
could.
observable with your progress amount.
Yeah, for the progress indicator, I felt like an observable would be too much overhead. So if you already have an observable set up, I would do a subscriber on that. But if you don't, and it's something really simple like just showing and hiding a div, I would just use an event emitter library like radio or whatever your preferred one is.
I've got one. It's probably more of like a studio-wide question. I
Yeah.
noticed you got, common, where you have all these different dependencies on this thing. As a studio, Skookum, you guys have a set. We use this, 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 and this, or is it more based on the individual, what they prefer as a team?
It's really based on the project. I think we're pretty language and library agnostic, and we just always try to use whatever the best tools for the job are. I'm sure there is some personal bias that comes into play, though. I mean, of course, we'll try to use what we know if we can, and what we like and what we're experienced with. But
I've noticed like kind of two families recently with the single-page apps. Like we've got like the Knockout stuff and we've also got like a different style that's backbone based.
Right.
And yeah, and they're both powerful in different ways. The backbone stuff we usually use with Knockout is going to be too much overhead and too slow. Knockout gets you running a lot faster.
yeah, I chose to showcase Knockout in this just because I think it's a lot easier for beginners to get started with. They have a lot of great interactive tutorials on their site, and when I was just starting out, it was a lot easier for me to grok that than Backbone. Mm-hmm.
What would be the upper limit on like Knockout before you would go to Backbone?
David Becker's the expert on this.
Yeah, because you've done both.
Maybe it's hard to quantify the number of observables.
I mean, if it feels really slow, I mean, if you're looking and if you're using the Chrome debug tools and you can see that there's just a lot of overhead and a lot of observable listeners hanging out there and slowing things down, then maybe it probably is time to look at something lighter.
And that's one of those things. And I've got a long history of experience developing, like back when Microsoft was actually really cool. And one of the things that you want to do is kind of do some modeling and testing with these different frameworks and so forth, and find out for your particular platform that you're targeting, where are the limits, are the practical limits anyway.
Right.
And that's part of just, kind of the tooling around you do in your spare time to figure out, okay, now I know that, here's the practical limit for this tool set versus that tool set or whatever. The other thing I would suggest is leaning on older developers like myself, because I'm sitting here watching this presentation and I'm realizing that a lot of these things that she's going into, like for instance the screen refreshing, I remember having to tackle that back in Visual Basic. That was a huge issue that we had to contend with back there. And so the point is, the old guys like me that can't churn out code very fast, we have at least seen these problems before, and sometimes we can lead you to a different direction.
Well, as I was telling him, we're kind of like the new old guard. It's
Yeah.
like, dude, it's a lot like Flash.
Yeah. Yep.
So, but yeah, the most popular answer for when do you do it is it depends.
Well, and the other thing I would say to that too is that the whole Wayne Gretzky skate to where the puck's going to be.
Right.
If you're building an application that's really going to be cutting edge, and you know that it's the hardware for it is just going to get better and better and better, then you can use something that's a little more on the edge. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also it goes back to my point about not everything needs to be an observable, because I think some of the slowness issues that you find with Knockout is just having too many observables, and maybe you could reevaluate if you didn't want to or didn't have the time or inclination to migrate to something different and say, okay, does everything that's an observable really need to be an observable?
Yeah, one scenario where we had trouble with Knockout was we had basically a spreadsheet, and every cell was connected, and there were like 1,000 cells, and that's where it started to like sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, well, thanks, guys.